Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Mallinson and I'm one of the co-founders of Feminist Internet, and I'm here today to share a lecture with you that was originally part of the Rendering Utopias intensive course delivered at the CCI in February of 2023. This course was a 4-day course open to all students across UAL and was designed to allow those involved to investigate our relationship with technologies, looking at the role they play in our lives with the aim of rendering a new, more inclusive model for the future. So throughout the week, we engaged in a series of critical conversations and activities, delving into subjects that explore the social and political implications of technology, as well as its revolutionary potential. So if you'd like to learn more about what was created during the course, you can check out the Rendering Utopias showcase, as well as the other content also featured on the CCI YouTube channel. So I want to begin by exploring this question of what is utopia? Quintessentially, in a sort of kind of basic description, it is a tool for imagining the other, envisioning another place, one that is inclusive, prosperous, peaceful, and so on. The idea of utopia in literature has this really important function of social critique. So utopias point out flaws in society by making comparisons to an imaginary ideal. They help to create a desire for change. But I want to go back for a moment and kind of trace the history of this concept. So the word utopia was coined in 1516 by Sir Thomas More and derived from the ancient Greek, coming from the words for not and place. So it kind of literally translates as no place. Philosopher Sir Thomas More created the word as a title for his Latin text Utopia, which is a work of fiction and socio-political satire, primarily depicting a fictional island society and its religious, social, and political customs. And you can see an illustration of that here on the screen. Since then, the term has become a kind of conceptual fixture in literature and media. Equally, its diametric opposite, the term dystopia, has existed for a long time, although not quite as long as utopia. Dystopia, again, is derived from ancient Greek for the words bad and hard, and place, so kind of literally translating to bad place, hard place, difficult place. It was believed to have been coined in 1747 in Lewis Henry Young's poem Utopia, or Apollo's Golden Days, which saw him describe how a dystopian society moved towards a utopian society. It is important to be aware that these concepts tend to denote the most far-reaching points of an opposing spectrum. They tend to describe somewhere that doesn't exist. They are descriptors for idealistic or cataclysmic visions of society. Culturally, we tend to see a lot more depictions of dystopia in film and media, a really vivid example being the dystopian future Los Angeles that's depicted in the Blade Runner franchise. And this is adapted from Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And here we see a society kind of ravaged by overpopulation, overconsumption, by the machine of capitalism, misogyny. The image of the city itself becomes a kind of metaphor for the colossal scale of capitalism reach. It's overcrowded, apartments at the top of towers escape the kind of fumes and pollution of the streets below. The Tyrell Corporation, who this kind of antagonistic pseudo-state at the center of the story, they occupy this pyramid-shaped building, which we can kind of see as another metaphor for capitalism. And the labor of working classes upholding these upper classes, allowing the rich to get richer, the poor stay poor, in this kind of pyramid-like scheme. And while this is a really visceral depiction of a dystopian society, the story also holds on to this kind of trope we see a lot in dystopian fiction, which tends to place a hero at center who is usually a man. There's a repeated kind of images of misogyny, and this central figure will be the antagonist who rises up against the antagonist, and that antagonist is usually a representative of the state and or capitalism. On the other hand, depictions of utopia, I would argue, are less common or difficult to pin down, in part because how do you isolate this idea of utopia? How do you envision a utopia for everyone? Because I think there is a problem when we start to fully binarize these concepts, saying, this is dystopian, this is utopian. And looking at Blade Runner again, while it depicts a dystopian society, you could argue that the upper classes are living a life of luxury. They're protected in their high towers with access to technologies, and they're benefiting from the rewards of capitalism that the lower classes could only dream of. So in this society, utopia and dystopia are a matter of perspective. And you could equally apply this logic to the world that we live in. This tension between these two states of existence is often explored and contested. Firstly, societies aren't homogeneous. The desires of one group of people may differ from another. I know my desires as a queer person vary greatly from a heterosexual person. So this idea of building a utopia is almost impossible because it's contradictory in its essence, and you could kind of argue that it's futile because what is one to something else will be different to someone else. And to come back again to depictions of utopia/dystopia, one of the most constant aspects you see in such depictions is the presence of technology. Whether it's a society that has prospered because of their access and autonomy over technology, or the destruction of society because of their dependence on technology, technology remains this kind of constant force. And this is in part because I believe that technology has become inseparable from our lives, but also because technologies are marketed to us as the tools which will improve our lives. Technology is a narrative tool for capitalism. It's a means through which to sell us a better vision of society, a better version of ourselves. It's a fantasy for reality. The creators of technologies say to us, buy this, use this, invest in this. Your life will greatly improve. Society is going to change, etc., etc. And I'm not sitting here and saying that it doesn't. Access to certain technologies in day-to-day life has fundamentally changed society. It's because of technology that I'm able to create this lecture, and I'm able to deliver it to you today in your home, that I'm able to travel to see my family and friends across the country and connect with people across the world through the internet, and that also certain diseases and illnesses don't present as much of a problem in society. These are all the outcomes of developments through technology. There's no denying that it has improved our quality of life, but it's all about perception of reality. What looks like progress in Western society is, for example, creating environmental degradation in South America or producing inhumane working conditions in factories in China. It's all a matter of perspective. And as I was saying, it's because of this perceived improvement that technology is often touted somewhat of a savior, both in reality and in fantasies like Blade Runner. And the people that invent certain technologies, particularly the ones that have a huge impact on our daily lives, they become idolized by society. So you only need to look at the cult built around people like Steve Jobs and Apple to see this in action. So a quick Google search reveals a plethora of articles idealizing the company's founders. And the same is true of other tech giants, people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. What happens to these people is they become part of the cultural lexicon. They become memed, tweeted about, and they become further idolized through a repetition of images and media. And they do this on kind of the canvases of their own invention in these digital worlds that they've helped to build. You only kind of have to look at the dystopian hellscape that Twitter has become since Elon Musk took over it. He's sort of reproduced it in an image of his envisioning. But it's not just the creators who are idolized, it's the products they create too. Think about the kind of culture war that takes place between Apple and Android users, the way that people queue outside of stores for new devices, wait every year with bated breath about kind of incremental upgrades. Just think about how important the iPhone has become to our daily lives. I'm sure everyone here has made a comment about how did people function before Google Maps or something along those lines. And not every new technology, though, has managed to embed itself into our lives and into culture in the same way as iPhones and Google Maps have. I think a really brilliant example of a technology failing to lead us towards utopia when in some ways it was touted to do so, is the rise and fall of voice assistants. So they gained a real popularity in around 2007, 2018. Alexa and kind of other voice assistants such as Google Home and Siri, they were tipped as being the future of personal technology. So you had an assistant in your home who could potentially order your shopping, adjust the heating, the lighting, the music, you could play games with it, etc. So you had so many tech companies touting these devices as the future of the user experience. I myself spent a lot of time researching them and their consequences. And during this time, technology writer Ben Thompson observed that voice assistants held a special place in the market because of their target location was the home. The one place in the entire world where smartphones were not necessarily the most convenient device or touch the easiest input method. More often than not, your smartphone is charging, and talking to a device doesn't carry the social baggage it might elsewhere. But it was voice assistants' unique selling point that became their downfall. You could not have a nuanced conversation with them. It wasn't a functional assistant. It was kind of far from it. In a recent article for The Guardian discussing the kind of downfall of voice assistants, John Naughton pulls a retired Alexa from his drawer to ask, "Alexa, why are you such a loss maker?" To which it replies, "This might answer your question. Mustard gas, also known as Lost, is manufactured by the United States." Naughton goes on to explain that Amazon was apparently selling the Alexa devices at a loss, with the intention that consumers would go on to buy more products from Amazon, and this has failed in part because of how difficult it has proved to do so. I'm sure we've all heard or experienced an Alexa horror story, children ordering toys accidentally, Alexa suddenly playing music without being prompted, and so on. And all of this has led to reports that Amazon's Alexa business is on track to be operating at a $10 billion loss by the end of the financial year. And the same is true of its competitors, with Google making major cuts to its assistant programs. Beyond usability, Home Assistants presented a kind of mountain of ethical and social issues, some of which we at Feminist Internet have tried to tackle. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can look up our Designing a Feminist Alexa project, as well as the Queering Voice AI project, where we developed a prototype voice interface purposed towards trans and non-binary people. Beyond Feminist Internet, they were constantly being debated within these utopian, dystopian bounds, with many particularly deriding the kind of potential for them to survey their users as completely dystopian. I think this question is extremely important because you have to look at the devices around you and ask, where are we being led? Is a techno-utopia one where a device is listening to every word I say, where I'm kind of left with no autonomy because my Home Assistant knows I've kind of run out of milk and thus orders from an artificially intelligent grocery store? But fundamentally, these social and ethical issues are not the reason Home Assistants have failed as consumer products. It's because of their inability to hold a nuanced conversation with the user. Alexa simply wasn't smart enough. But in this failure, I think there is a discovery that in a future successful relationship with technology is one that's nuanced and uninvasive. If we're going to one day engage with the technology in a truly conversational way, then that conversation needs to operate like an actual conversation. And with these devices, it became clear quite quickly how much they were reading from a script. But while voice assistants did not impact the world the way their developers intended, there have been some technologies through our history which have fundamentally changed society, and in premise could kind of be interrogated under this banner of utopian. The internet fundamentally changed the world. Some would argue for the worse, some would argue for the better, but in premise, the internet was supposed to provide us with a decentralized network to communication, allowing us to share information across borders without the jurisdiction of the state. Joshua Coles wrote that, like most technologies, the mainstream adoption of the internet was surrounded by utopian rhetoric, but the internet is more than just technology. It offers a virtual reality that is designed to simulate place, and this makes the internet a utopia in itself rather than merely the subject of utopian thought. Here he's sort of reiterating this idea that because the internet exists as a place of meeting where you can occupy a digital manifestation of yourself or another with avatars, etc., it is inherently utopian because of its kind of transformative potential. In a lecture, technologist Carla O'Brien speaks about how, as a trans woman, simulation games such as Second Life allowed her to create a digital avatar of herself that more accurately represented who she felt she was. And I think this highlights this beautifully transformative potential of the internet, where we're able to kind of leave our bodies behind and become something new. But equally, because of this transformative potential that the internet holds, we've seen it become this kind of contested site of control between governments and private corporations, and it's become this place of multitudes, of plurality. It's kind of everything at once, and it's a tool of capitalism and the state, who are using it to monitor our actions, build data profiles, sell us products, track our browsing history. But it's also a meeting space for activism, for organizing, for queer and trans people to connect. And in another kind of deeper, darker area of the internet, you can take part in various illegal activities. So now I think the internet perfectly occupies this space where it sits comfortably kind of nowhere. It's a contested site. It's not utopian. It's not dystopian, because there's always a way to carve out a new space on the internet with either good or bad intentions. But I also think the idea that the internet would remain this utopian dreamscape that it was kind of thought to be is frankly naive, because capitalism will always co-opt spaces where there is money to be made. The state will always try to exert power. Illicit activity will always find a way to exist in the shadows. But I do think what I want to hold on to here is the essence that this fundamental principle that the internet presented of decentralization, connectivity, statelessness, nothing like that has ever existed before, and so much change has come about because of it. But to think beyond the internet, which is kind of most obvious example, I would argue, there's actually no other technology that I think has come close to feeling quite as utopian or dystopian as the camera. The camera was and continues to be a technology that asks us to kind of confront ourselves and our future and our reality. It presented people with originally with the opportunity to freeze time, to take a piece of reality and make it solid. So Susan Sontag, who I'm going to talk a little bit about here, wrote in her notes on photography, essentially the camera makes everyone a tourist in other people's reality and eventually in one's own. And she's speaking about this idea that the camera is a tool for archiving reality, and that through images and photography we can browse the past, but not only our own, other people's too. Over time, photography has evolved from a professional activity and an expensive hobby to something completely democratized and accessible. And everyone has a camera now. Everyone has one in their pockets. It's in the fidelity of the lens on an iPhone is so high quality that we can, zoom and in as close as possible. They've become a kind of extension of the body, of the eye, of the arm. Modern cameras and imaging devices, they close physical spaces. As I say, they bring us closer to artists at concerts. They allow us to see details never been seen before. They allow us to see through walls into the stars, inside cell walls. Through the camera, our relationship to scale has completely changed. We're no longer confined by the kind of optics of our own eye. What's also changed over time is photography's relationship to the truth. Historically, photography was a way of achieving absolute truth, this idea that the camera cannot lie. But now with the advent of digital imaging software, a photograph can take on an entirely new meaning. It can be altered or even rendered without a camera. And all of this growth in photography has been matched by the mechanisms of capitalism and the state. Photography, the camera, and images have become one of the single most important tools of control. To go back to Susan Sontag, she writes that a capitalist society requires a culture based on images. It needs to furnish vast amounts of entertainment in order to stimulate buying and anesthetize the injuries of class, race, and sex. And It needs to gather unlimited amounts of information, the better to exploit natural resources, increase productivity, keep order, make war, and give jobs to bureaucrats. The camera's twin capacities to subjectify reality and objectify it ideally serve these needs as strengthen them. Cameras define reality in the two ways essential to the workings of an advanced industrial society: as a spectacle for the masses and as an object of surveillance for rulers. The production of images also furnishes a ruling ideology. The social change is replaced by a change in images. The freedom to consume a plurality of images and goods is equated with freedom itself. The narrowing of free political choice to free economic consumption requires the unlimited production and consumption of images. Now, just to unpack this a little further, I think what's really important to highlight is that this was written in 1977, and what Susan Sontag states around surveillance is even more true today. What she's really getting at here is how the camera has become both a tool of capitalism and the state, and what began as a tool of invention, a means of capturing reality, are now tools mounted on flagpoles and street corners, kind of constantly watching, constantly recording. And cameras have evolved through software and AI to be able to recognize people. So I live in London, and it's one of the most surveyed cities in the world. And these advances in facial recognition, they present huge social and ethical questions. And for some, the paranoia around being watched has reached such heights that some people have the cameras covered on their laptop, and because they think they're being watched. And there's this whole internet conspiracy in America, which is to some degree spread globally, around this idea of, is the FBI watching me? And Apple even introduced a notification into iOS that lets you know when the camera has recently been activated, which is kind of ironic if you consider the power that Apple has, the idea that they are truly protecting you. But in some ways it's very true. The state is watching. Imagine that a notification existed for every time you were seen on camera. And I really challenge you to kind of to think about that. If your phone notified you every time you were seen on camera. CCTV is used to monitor public life, but it's also used to stop and prevent crime. It's used as a tool of documentation in journalism. The camera has become one of the kind of primary proprietary tools of violence. It's used to document violence. It's used to intervene in violence. It's used to prove violence in a court of law. It's this multifaceted, multi-use tool. And I really do believe that it's kind of one of the most important, if not the most important invention of modern times. But again, I don't want to just focus on the dystopian aspects like the internet. I want to try and remind you of the kind of magic of the camera and its utopian premise. It's the camera that allows us to produce images, create films, produce art, make this presentation. And what I'm kind of asking us to think about here is what something could be, can be, without the mechanisms of capitalism and the state, or perhaps even how it can exist in opposition to such forces. But I do think it's important to understand the lived reality of such technologies so that we can kind of begin to move beyond them. So to dive into this a little deeper, the harsh reality is that technologies are, as it stands, in their kind of current mode of idea to manufacture to consumption, they're destroying the planet and people. If things continue as they are, we're heading towards a dystopian future of complete kind of, to be frank, environmental collapse. So I just want to share a few examples here. And as I said, I think it's really important that we do confront these realities. So I think we'll all have seen this focus in recent years on electric cars. So in the UK, for example, they'll ban petrol engine cars by the year 2030, although this looks unlikely at the moment due to the inaction of the current government installing electric car charging stations across the country, particularly outside of London. But equally, while this shift away from fossil fuels is a necessary one that will lead us towards a more sustainable future, the current manufacturing processes for electric cars, namely the large quantities of lithium that's required to produce their batteries, is having a catastrophic effect on the environment. So lithium is extracted by taking the mineral-rich brine from underneath salt flats in countries such as Bolivia in South America, after which it is left to evaporate in a series of ponds for 12 to 18 months, forming a mixture of potassium, magnesium, borax, and lithium salts across these kind of fluorescent coloured pools. And you can see this process playing out here in images on the screen. So Laura Grace Simpkins notes in her research on a lithium mine in Bolivia that the common environmental side effect of lithium mining are water loss, ground stabilization, biodiversity loss, increased salinity of rivers, and contaminated soil and toxic waste. Beyond this, to produce a ton of lithium, up to 2 million litres of water are required. The majority of this is lost to the sky, so the indigenous Aymara community who Laura Grace Simpkins' research was had a particular focus on, who live and work around the Salar mine in Bolivia, they're being directly impacted by this mine's water use. So many of them are growing quinoa, raising livestock, selling salt and flamingo eggs, which are native to the land. All of which these are traditional forms of income generation, which after hundreds of years and generation after generation are now being compromised, and this threatens their entire livelihood, all in the name of a kind of sustainability. And the crux of the problem is that as developed nations move towards these utopian ideals of sustainability, prosperity, etc., underdeveloped nations' natural resources, labour force, and particularly indigenous populations are being exploited and frankly destroyed. If we look at actual electronics manufacture, there's problems throughout the production process. So only recently were factory workers in China protesting again for better working conditions. Just to give you some examples of the problems these people have faced and continue to face, in 2007, Steve Jobs decided at the very last minute to change the iPhone screen to glass. And this meant that approximately 800 workers at a factory-built dormitory in China were awakened in the middle of the night to work around the clock to meet this new deadline set by Apple. And before I continue, I just want to give a trigger warning. I'm going to talk about some instances of violence as well as suicide. So if that's something you are keen to listen to, I would just skip forward a couple minutes. So in 2009, an employee of Foxconn, who are a manufacturing company whose key partner is Apple, was accused of stealing a prototype of a new iPhone. And following this accusation, his apartment was searched and he was beaten by Foxconn's security team in July of that year, and he committed suicide. Unfortunately, this wasn't the end of suicides at Foxconn. Following complaints of low pay and brutal working conditions, 2010 saw 15 workers throw themselves from the building, committing suicide. There were a further 4 in 2011, and then 1 more reported per year in 2018. And while none have been reported since then, any suicide attempts that take place outside of working hours or the factory are not reported by the company. But it's not just the way in which technologies are being made, it's also the way they're being used. Artificial intelligence is involving warfare at a rate quicker than we've seen in recent decades. Autonomous and semi-autonomous drones are becoming a cheap and easy tool for attacking conventional targets, rather than sending in the Air Force or ground soldiers. Beyond this, the use of lethal weapons, AI is being put to use in training models, in threat sensing, in data processing, and so many other applications. And it's wealthy developed nations who have access to such technologies, allowing them to exert control in war. AI presents a particularly complex set of ethical questions to navigate. AI is everywhere now. It's in your pockets. It's TikTok. It's Instagram. It's the algorithms predicting the content you want to see. It's ChatGPT. It's DALL-E. It's really being debated in the public sphere in a way that it never really has before, particularly in the last few months to kind of beginning of 2023. We know publicly we are considering its implications both socially and ethically in our current reality, but also in our future. We're asking this question, will AI lead us towards utopia? And that's because AI, as I've said, it's now everywhere. It's in these technologies, but it's also in warfare. It's in visual recognition. It's in predictive policing. It's being used in employment, in benefit systems, in healthcare. It really has kind of become everywhere. But the real problems lie in the hidden realities of these technologies. It's the impact that these hidden realities are having on underdeveloped nations, on the planet, on our environment. And the problem is that capitalism and technology companies and developers, they're selling us this dream of a new future with technology at the same time as exploiting natural resources and physically harming people. This notion of utopia put forth by biomedia, by companies, of a technologically advanced society unaffected by climate crisis or climate crises which are solved by technology. This kind of complete sustainable model of a future with social and political peace is a completely unattainable concept if any community has to be exploited to achieve it. One community's utopia should not create another's dystopia. And that's really what I'm trying to highlight here with these examples. And I know that some of it is difficult to listen to, but I think it's important to confront the reality of the situation we live in, because ultimately we are complicit in its continued production. But I want to be clear that we are not necessarily entirely responsible. Blame lies with the people who create and perpetuate these problems, but we are seduced by capitalism and its rewards. I think an analogy of this seduction with capitalism is the kind of cultural obsession that we have with reality television and wealth culture. It's a sort of utopia through osmosis, because of what in part it allows you to achieve is to live vicariously through others. You're allowed into the intimate moments and lives of people in the kind of upper echelons of society. You're allowed to build a vision of what your life might look like in this shiny utopia of wealth, all through the power of the camera. So how do we move beyond this? Well, I want to leave you with the proposition that we abandon these problematic kind of co-opted visions of dystopia and utopia and think of these concepts as more than just literary tools or plot devices or narratives that are being sold to us. I want to suggest that we approach utopia and dystopia of imagining somewhere else from a position of emotion, a place of feeling, from a place of inclusion. Leave behind these these tools of capitalism and allow them to become freeing, allow them to help us generate ideas, to grow and build, as well as also to resist and tear down that which does not serve us. I want to ask, is utopia something that we can feel inside ourselves, mutually, and somewhere that we can go, somewhere that we can stay, somewhere that we can build by imagining something that exists in the future, in a multitude of forms, in a kind of multitude of definitions. What I said at the beginning was that utopia is essentially the idea of imagining the other, a place for another life to exist. And I think as human beings, we are sort of always looking for utopia. Our mind is kind of like a render engine. We're always building, always imagining something new. And sometimes those things seem like a fiction or a fantasy, but it's possible for us to blur the line between fiction and reality through creativity, through play, through imagining something else. So I really would like to thank you for listening, and I really encourage you to check out the other videos that are part of this series, particularly the showcase, where you can discover some of the work produced by the students during the course and see how they took these concepts and applied them and envisioned a new future for technology. Goodbye.